Hi, and welcome to Mavericks Radio. I'm your host, Chris Roy, and this is the place to be to become your best self, do work you love, and live life on your terms. On this podcast, we speak to Mavericks who inspire us, people who play to their strengths, follow their heart, and do their best to create positive impact. We aim to get the insight and wisdom from their story to give you the clarity, courage, and confidence to carve your own path through life. This week's guest is Hanna Naima McCloskey, the CEO and founder of Fearless Futures. Hanna is just one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. Diversity and inclusion is such a big topic right now, but so many organisations and so many people are basically papering over the cracks. And Hanna basically nails that. She drives below the surface, talks about the true root of inequity and inequality in society and what organisations really need to do to bring about social justice and change. This, for me, is one of the most important podcasts you can listen to this year. So let's jump right in and hear what Hanna has to say. Hanna, I'm really excited to have you here today. So, and we love what Fearless Futures is all about. So tell us a little bit about you and tell us a little bit about what you're up to with Fearless Futures.
I'll start with me first. Yep. So I am Hanna Naima McCloskey. I am the founder of Fearless Futures. We are not too far from where I grew up, which was in Brent, in Wembley in Brent, and born to an Algerian mum and a British father, and basically I've lived in Northwest London all my life and now also live back in that area. And I guess part of the motivation for starting Fearless Futures is really connected actually to my heritage and the kind of realizations and awakenings I had in relation to what it means to be of mixed heritage in this country, but somebody who is read as white, but also what the implications of being, for my mum, an Arab Muslim migrant woman when she came here in the late 1970s, wow. What it means for my Algerian family that do live here, and really kind of coming to grips with, racism in this country, what it looks like, also what it looks like kind of globally. And that was part of the kind of work that I was doing on myself that led to, in some way, informing some of the kind of foundational thinking for Fearless Futures. So that's been a huge part. Me is a huge part of Fearless Futures, but me specifically in relation to some of those dynamics in particular.
Makes sense. And tell us what Fearless Futures actually is.
So Fearless Futures is an education organisation. We do in-person education, and I say that we do that for 99% of the time, except for the times where we're sending emails to people to coordinate and organise such training. Our kind of tagline or our mission statement is to support people to critically engage their thinking, to understand and challenge the root causes of inequities, and in so doing, to support them to grow powerful new leadership and design for transformative change. So there's quite a lot in there. But what we're really kind of speaking to in that kind of slightly too long sentence is a need to surface root causes if we're going to make a difference to people's lives. We take as a kind of given within our starting point that the world is unjust and unequal currently, the way that it's been crafted and designed, but we're ultimately a hopeful organisation insofar as we believe that it is 100% possible to create a world that is just, that is inclusive, where everyone can belong, feel safe, have legitimacy, dignity, and so on. And the opposite of those things is not an inevitability, but it is something that is very real and impacts people's lives every single day. But it's also so normalised, right?
Of course.
For many of us who don't live within the sights of these exclusions and inequalities, we're like a fish in water. We just think that it's a kind of normal part of life, that this is just the way that it is. And for us, part of moving people towards action is to realise actually it isn't the way that it has to be, and that these things are live and real and true for lots of people. And then crucially supporting them to engage the power and privilege they do have in relation to certain inequalities, to take meaningful action for them, to challenge those things. And we do that through a leadership perspective and then from a design perspective. So leadership is looking at things on an interpersonal level. So who am I in relation to other people that I either work with or know, and so on. And then the design piece is about how we have a a method for inclusive design for our processes and our outputs and our internal cultures within organisations. So that's what we do.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. There's a whole lot of stuff here I really want to unpack. So I'm really curious, because I know obviously you've kind of done work with various NGOs kind of personally before Fearless Futures. I know you've done the kind of international relations and conflict management and stuff and all that kind of thing. Let's take on the kind of the startup path for a start, because you've effectively started up an organisation. What's kind of been the path to actually lead you to the startup, and then some of the challenges of actually being a startup founder?
Gosh, so many. So I think I was working, so I did lots of work in the international development space, as you said, and then conflict management, a master's and so on, and ended up in investment banking for a bunch of unusual reasons. But I had this idea, which I've now discovered to be not true, which is that the private sector is where everything of importance happens, which is a very common trope, actually. Lots of people think that's where you get stuff done. I joined an investment bank right at the beginning of the financial crash, because I was naive enough at the time to believe that there was a consensus around the fact that we needed a new financial system because the current one didn't work for everyone. Not true. Not everyone did believe that we needed a new financial system.
Absolutely.
Some people really liked the existing financial system and just wanted to repair it back to where it was. I also was naive enough to believe that one person in a massive institution was going to be able to change the way things get done, which is also categorically not a possibility. It's just not the way change happens, I've since learned. But it was during my time in investment banking where, bizarre as it might seem, I was really so alert to the prevailing kind of dynamics of who and who wasn't in such a space. So coming from my mindset of how do we create a financial system that is fair and equal, it turns out that if you just have white people, if you just have men people, if you just have middle class people in those spaces, you're going to end up with outcomes that are not going to be serving people who don't live within those kind of sites of their identity. So that was my first thing. And my second thing was just doesn't make any sense. This cannot be the way that we kind of structure an organisation. Why is it that certain people don't get to fully participate? Obviously, acknowledging in the first place that the institutions themselves weren't set out to do what I felt that they needed to be doing if they were going to be living their true purpose. But that aside, it just was a deeply unfair terrain. And so I ended up doing I started getting really involved in diversity and inclusion work inside the organisation. I was on steering committees and D&I councils galore, and nothing changed, nothing happened. We'd meeting after meeting, and what happened for me is I ended up Googling, as you do, and within Google, sometimes you can end up down these rabbit holes. We've all been there. Wikipedia through to hyperlink, and then hours have gone past. I ended up coming across Black feminist thought and scholarship. Black feminist or Black feminism is principally the kind of mode of scholarship for Black women. It's it's global scholarship, but what I found really powerful in reading the likes of Bell Hooks, who's my all-time favourite human being, and I do firmly believe, and I say regularly, that if everyone just read her work, Fearless Futures wouldn't need to exist, because she is just an incredible activist, educator and scholar. But what Black feminists have been doing throughout history, actually, is exploring the ways in which different oppressions interconnect, looking at the way racism connects and interconnects and is entwined with racism and is entwined with class and classism, in order to kind of illuminate the unique nature of what occurs when those things come together. And that was particularly important because, and is particularly important because often these issues are thought about in silos. People and scholars thinking about racism as one piece, sexism. The mainstream feminist movement is predominantly white, middle class, heterosexual women saying these are the things that we need, without understanding or seeking to explore, and in some cases actually outright dismissing, erasing the concerns of women of colour, trans women, working class women, and women that exist across many, many sites of oppression. And black feminism says, no, we can hold these concepts in our head at the same time. And it is radical and transformative because it believes that justice is possible when we do engage in understanding all of these things simultaneously. So I ended up, thanks to google.com, uncovering this body of thought. And it was incredibly powerful for me in terms of understanding my own whiteness in the world and what that affords me as I navigate the planet, but also to become closer in my relationship to my heritage and to, I think, really be able to get present to what the struggles were for my mum and other members of my Algerian family in particular, that was very both very kind of important personally but also very liberating. So that was kind of happening at once, and simultaneously I was seeing the complete ineffectiveness of the mainstream diversity and inclusion narrative, action, whatever you want to call it. And I thought, God, there must be another way of doing this. One of the main things that I found really powerful in the writing of Bell Hooks in particular is she also writes as an educator, as someone that works with people across different backgrounds in her work in universities predominantly to surface and understand these issues. And so she writes a lot about pedagogy, and pedagogy is just a fancy word for saying the way people learn or the way that you teach. And she does a huge amount of writing on this, which our work is really heavily drawn from, most of which is about engaging in discomfort, being able to hold people in hold people, in particular those who have power and privilege, in emotional discomfort when confronted with the ways in which they might be showing up in the world and the impact that has. That for me was something that I felt was really, really missing in the diversity and inclusion space in most workplaces, because it was all happy clappy, let's high five, everything's great. Absolutely. Let's celebrate difference, all of which is fine if you've done the kind of the restorative work in the first place that enables a celebration. Not everything can be celebrated because some things are really painful. And we need pain to be healed before we can celebrate. So I basically was observing and witnessing very troubling narratives that my hypothesis was this is why nothing changes, because no one's prepared to engage in discomfort. No one's prepared that some people might feel upset in order to give other people their safety, legitimacy and dignity. Right. And there was a kind of false equivalency between white people being upset about things and the harm of racism, right? Which is obviously not the same. Or men being upset that they might, that people are saying that they shouldn't be sexually harassing people, and the harm of being sexually harassed. These are very different things.
Yeah, really.
But there's a lot of conflation because workplaces aren't set up actually for emotional conflict.
No, not at all.
We all just sort of walk around pretending everything's okay, the passive aggressive email and whatever it might be. These aren't the kind of emotional frameworks that you need to really do deep work on these issues. So all of this I was observing, and I thought there's got to be another way. And so Fearless Futures was really born out of my observations of what wasn't working and a kind of vision of what it would take for stuff like this to work. I should say that we also work in schools, and that's in fact where we started, or where I started the organisation. And the schools work is still a huge part of what we do, and it's incredibly important, powerful, and very hopeful work. There were a few reasons to start in schools. One is that there were fewer barriers to entry for me personally as somebody starting an organisation. Of course. Schools are in many ways, because their mission is ultimately to care for young people, in the first instance, they were also much more open to having a new intervention in their schools, which was really exciting. And on another note, young people are really very blunt. If they think that you're boring or crap, they will tell you. And so being someone that didn't have a facilitation background, who was embarking on this new skill, I needed to know whether I was any good at it for it to...
Talk about immediate feedback.
Yeah, exactly. They just simply wouldn't show up if they thought it was boring, not interesting, not relevant. But it turned out I was a great facilitator, which is obviously really handy, given that was the direction of Fearless Futures. And obviously, had I not been a very good facilitator, Fearless Futures either might not exist today, but also might be doing something very different. Although I've always had a deep connection to kind of in-person education. I just, I guess, sort of just in my gut, feel like that's the most important way that we can do stuff.
You can see literally, people. You can look people in the eyes and kind of connect. Absolutely right.
Yeah, and kind of experience their humanity firsthand. I think is really, really important. So our schoolwork remains, and we started there, and then we've added in the work that we do with organisations, principally senior leaders, thereafter. But your question was, what are the challenges, or like what happened? Yeah. And for me, lots of people always say, like, was it really scary? Like the day that you like handed in your notice. Weirdly, it wasn't scary at all. I didn't have this sense of like impending doom or like concern, and I guess it's. For me, I just had this deep sense that that's what I just needed to do. So for me, it wasn't... I do think it was quite reckless, actually. When I think about it now, it didn't make it that much sense. But, I think it's important to acknowledge that having been an investment banker, I had savings. Not many people have the opportunity to risk an experiment when they have financial obligations, when they have families. I didn't. I'm married, so my husband's been able to support in emotional and financial ways. So for me, I just had this deep sense. I'd been to New York on holiday a few weeks prior. And been walking through the streets of New York. I'd already had the idea for Fearless Futures. I Googled, I was like, if this other organisation exists that already does what I think Fearless Futures should do, I'll just go join them as an intern. Like, I didn't really want to start anything. I just wanted to be involved in something that did this kind of work. So I Googled a lot. Nothing, which was a real bugger, and I was like, oh no,
I've got to do
things are getting serious now. And then was walking through New York, and New York has this incredible energy that I really connect with. I don't know whether you've ever been.
Loads of times. It's amazing.
It's a great city, and I just thought, God, now's the time to do it. And I mentioned it to my husband, and I was like, I really think I might just quit this week. And he's like, okay, sure, well, let's just, have a chat, think this through. And I was like, cool. Anyway, and then like 2 days later, on the Thursday, I called and I was like, hi, Paul. So I resigned just now, and I've got 3 months, and then I'm doing it. And he was like, shit, like I thought we were going to have... I thought we were going to have a chat and a plan. I was like, I know, but I just felt I had to do it. I'm really sorry. Like, it's going to be fine. And he was just like, what the hell? Like, we're meant to be in a husband and wife relationship where we actually discuss this kind of thing. So that was a bit of a shock. My parents were also really shocked. I think they thought it was, again, a really reckless thing to do. Like everyone in my parents' family, they're like the first people to go to university. My parents, my mum thought it was absolutely nonsensical that I would give up a secure, well-paid job to just like fanny about in her world and like just give something a go. I think she just felt like this is just something in many ways that like, she's a teacher that she would never have done. It was just like such an alien concept that people would just leave well-paid jobs to just have a go at something.
Kind of generational values as much as anything, right?
Totally. And I also think it's, being an immigrant to this country, like why would you just, obviously what she did herself, like moving countries is a very risky thing to do and potentially conceived that way and very scary, but like then to be like, she has a good job, this doesn't make any sense. And my dad, I think until recently just thought the whole thing was just like never going to work, and they weren't mean about it.
No.
But they were just like, this is like they've had the same job their entire lives,
Right.
you know. So there was a lot of people kind of were like humouring me, not necessarily my parents, but like people I knew. They were like, okay, that's great, it's going to work in schools and with adults, doing this kind of deep radical education, sure, got it, like we'll see you on the other side of that. And it's really hard when you'll know this perhaps, when you start up an organisation, whenever you meet people always ask you like, how's it going? And it's like so hard to describe, like, am I an 8 out of 10 for where I should be at this moment in time? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, where should you be?
What are the metrics?
What are the metrics? Like, what's the timeline that we're working? If I'm 25 years into the timeline, then maybe I'm flying. If the timeline's only 1 year, then maybe I'm not doing very well because whatever's happened.
Right.
So I think I always felt the pressure also in the early days of like having to justify why I'd done what I'd done by having to say like all this amazing stuff is happening, which I never really actually had to say. I was just like, actually it's really hard. I could never really lie very effectively. But it feels like, in particular, when you think about who startup founders are in our wider culture, they are, the stories we hear are the people who have like raised many millions in seed funding, they've gone and they've got this many sales in whatever time.
It's all very Dragon's Den, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, and very like a kind of hyper masculine. You've got to hit these targets, and you've got swanky offices and all of this stuff. Needless to say, Fearless Futures has not had that journey. It has been much, much, much more slow and steady. And we've never been externally funded. Everything's been through organic growth. So none of it has actually been that sexy until probably like the last year. Where even our sexy is still like not as sexy. It's still granny knickers compared to some organisations' version of sexy.
But that's still really cool. And what I love about that is, your journey is very similar to Maverick's in that way. We've kind of grown organically, self-funded, all that kind of thing. But it's that kind of thing of navigating this thing where you have to, you clearly have a bit of a vision, even if that's kind of emerging or whatever, or purpose, probably a better word. And to navigate that space where it's like people around you are not necessarily anti, but sometimes just the fact that, as you say, to use your words, they're humouring you, sometimes that's almost more difficult, as it were. As you mentioned, the last year has kind of been the granny knickers year. But tell us about the last year then, what's kind of happened? So
I would say the kind of shift has occurred in the last 2 years, but we've seen the kind of the fruits of what we've sown, or the
fruits of your labour.
Yes, the fruits of our labour. Good. I always confuse a pun or whatever it is. So we've seen the fruits of our labour really increase in the last year. I think what we've seen occur is that we've managed to stumble across some really courageous internal agitators in some very large organisations, and you can never underestimate the power of a few courageous people who really get what it is that you're doing and really want to stand for something within their own organisations.
Right.
And luck, chance, whatever it is, the universe working in our favour, whatever we might call it, we managed to find a few of those key people, and the work we've been able to do with them in organisations has as a consequence gone to another level. And the reality is that the kind of work that Fearless Futures does, because it's so different to, a 45-minute unconscious bias webinar or whatever these weird things that people are selling to companies that obviously haven't worked, otherwise you wouldn't need to keep redoing them every 2 years or whatever it is. Because we're so different, you're going to need to have someone that really, like, in their gut is prepared to use some of their own political and internal reputational capital to say, look, folks, we can just keep doing what we've been doing. We can webinar till we're blue in the face, or there might be some other way that's going to take a bit more courage from us as an organisation and from our staff to be prepared to be in a space of discomfort, to be prepared to invest in long-term partnerships, to spend our time working through stuff that is so complex and nuanced that the idea that you could resolve it in an hour is like laughable. It's like saying I could teach you to code, Chris, and you'd be able to generate your own app in an hour. No one would ever say that. They'd be like, that's a really silly thing to say. They'd say, you're an idiot for trying to tell me that you could teach me to code in an hour. You'd be laughed. But for this other area where we think we can, so a lot of our work is saying to people, like, the paradigm that you're operating in is not fit for purpose if your vision is XYZ. If you do actually genuinely want to create an organizational culture that's inclusive, where belonging is lived for everyone, where you have the fullness of humanity within the four walls of your organization, this current method is just not going to cut it. So can you imagine? And then somebody's probably, one of the things that I've realized is that the person that we're speaking to has probably been someone that's had to beg, borrow and steal to get the money in the first place to do the webinar rollout.
Right.
So can you imagine they then have to be like, oh, sorry, Bob, I got it wrong. I've got to go with some other approach. That takes a lot of
chutzpah.
Yeah, it does. And somebody that's open to having got it wrong amongst senior stakeholders and whatever it might be. So it's hard to find those courageous characters. We're thrilled that we have, and courage, like lots of people say, is contagious. And when one courageous person is able to say, like, this is how I did it in my organization, this is how I got the wheels turning to do something that is a really big departure from traditional ways of doing things, other people are like, oh my God, okay, it's not this terribly scary thing. It can be done. And so that's been part of what's kind of generated the last year's worth of really, really significant momentum. We're working globally now, which I didn't think was going to be happening. Lots of work upcoming in the US, as well as remaining in the UK, also out in East Asia. I must be really precise. We're working with global, predominantly UK and American global organizations in these places.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think we know the limitations of where we can be useful and where we can't.
Yep.
And there are some contexts where we know that we don't have anything to offer, and there are probably really amazing, in fact, there certainly are amazing local organizations doing, similar work that those organizations should engage with. So it's in particular global contexts where we're not into domination. That's the opposite, in fact, of what we're about. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's talk about impact, because I think what has one of the Mavericks has been on your kind of flagship course, as it were, and came back literally a changed person for it. As you say, I come from a people OD kind of background, and in so many organisations, as you say, diversity and inclusion is it's a PR stunt or whatever else. What's different about the Fearless Futures approach, and what kind of impact have you seen it have in organisations?
So the first thing is that we take an intersectional approach, and when I say intersectional, what I mean is kind of referring to the piece around Black feminist scholarship that kind of brought this to the fore, which is really recognising that inequalities are interconnected, and that we cannot just look at things through a single lens. That's absolutely imperative. Too many organisations do the following. They say, we need to get more women into senior leadership, and then they say, we're going to have a gender programme of some description. And then they say, and we're going to do gender for the next, for example.
Right.
Now it turns out, firstly, everybody has a gender, so let's put that to one side. Everybody has a gender, but not all genders are prioritised in the same way as others.
Right.
But also, people have genders that interconnect with other issues and inequalities and identities. Totally. And the reality is that the struggles of a white woman while she experiences sexism are different to a woman of colour. Right? Because the woman of colour experiences both racism and sexism simultaneously. She can't just say, I'm going to switch off my racism and only think about the sexism I experience according to your internal programme. She's existing across both of those pieces simultaneously. A woman who is bisexual will be navigating all sorts of nuanced, complex dynamics to her identity that a heterosexual woman simply will not have to face. And so if we want to work on one agenda, we have to be able to acknowledge the ways in which these other issues complicate, are interconnected with, compound any one particular struggle. And it depends, and this is the same for whichever way you look at it, whether, across any movement, whether it's the movement for LGBT rights, feminism, racial justice, whatever it might be, we always see that there are certain people within those spaces who are privileged and those who aren't.
Absolutely.
That's the reason why we have Black Pride in this country, because Black people were not able to be their full selves within the LGBTQ plus umbrella within the mainstream space, for example.
Makes sense.
And it's also why we don't remember the very kind of, as it were, the grandmothers of the Stonewall riots were two trans women of colour, Sylvia Rivera, Martha P. Johnson, because they have been erased and other stories have been privileged within that narrative, even when they were the people instigating that struggle and really putting their life on the line for those things. So until we're able to see the way that these issues connect, we're never going to be serving everyone within those spaces. And that's a really dangerous place to be, because you're telling some people implicitly, you need to wait your turn. We don't care about you just this moment. We'll come to you, whoever you are that's not a middle class straight white woman, will come to you in 2026 when we've got round to that. And that's not cool.
That's not cool at all.
That's not cool, but that's what's happening. That's what's happening all the time. We're saying, no, we'll come to you when we're ready. And the people that are never going to be ready to come to that issue, because the people setting that agenda simply probably aren't experiencing the lived reality of the people that they're telling to wait. So that's the first part. We really just believe you have to be able to engage with all of this. Now, what comes with that is it means people that don't experience an issue, so for example, as a heterosexual person, I don't experience the various struggles that people within the wider LGBTQ plus umbrella are experiencing every single day. I have a responsibility as a heterosexual person to dismantle and deconstruct the heteronormative world in which we live. I have a responsibility to stand up for, speak out, pass the mic to, whatever it might be, those who live within a site of struggle that I don't experience. Now, for a lot of people, and I'm not excluding myself from that, that's really difficult to realise that you benefit from stuff because you don't experience something. And
there's an absolute payoff.
There's an absolute payoff, but people don't want to think that they're getting a payoff. People just want to think that everything's cushy, that they're all happy clappy, that it's all really, that it's just normal, it's nothing to do with them, they didn't invent any of this stuff, rather than seeing themselves as getting perpetually paid off by a system that at the expense of others. And so we deal with that head on. We don't shy away from that.
Love that.
And that's hard. It's hard for a lot of people who have privilege and power. It shouldn't need to be hard, but they find it emotionally difficult, and our organisations are tailored to prioritise them over people who are on the sharp end of this stuff. So that's ultimately key. And then the second thing, really quickly, it's easier to explain, is that our learning is experiential. While I've jabbered on with a lot of kind of detail and theory in this particular context, the learning itself in our workshops is experiential, which means we don't have PowerPoint slides where we're telling people, you've got to remember these 8 things. If you do these 8 things, you're going to be fine, or these are your do's, these are your don'ts. It's not like that at all. Participants construct their own insights from engaging in experiential activities, and that is really, really important for our work. Firstly, no one likes being told what to do, even if it's a good thing. Even with the recycling, we all have a bug to bear with. Why can't I put the yogurt carton in that bloody bag? Yeah, exactly. Why is it that isn't allowed? So for us, it's really important that people realise that they're opting in to this learning, that to give them back their agency. And we say to people, look, we're giving you a set of experiences here. You can take them or leave them at the end of your training programme. While you're in it, we'd really like you to engage fulsomely. But afterwards, if it doesn't work for you, that's cool. Crack on. Your old beliefs are still going to be there. They're not going anywhere, because we're not that smart. We're not brainwashing you. This is for you to be able to engage with, take what you want. And that for us is really important, because it creates a context of agency for people and freedom, knowing that then our facilitators aren't there to convince anyone. I'm not here to convince anyone either. Our energy will be spent in other ways.
I love that.
People can show up then in a way that's for them in those moments.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just kind of taking that from kind of experience to action, as it were. Because as you said, that
was your question around impact.
Yeah,
what happens?
I'm really kind of curious, because obviously if you get someone who's like a senior person from a large organisation, you know, a bit of an agitator, as it were, and they then want to go back and do something from these experiences they've had, how do they typically tend to translate that to action that then that creates an impact?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of multiple tiers to the ways in which people do things differently, depending on who they are in the world. There are various levels of responsibility and so on. We never underestimate the power of people reframing the narrative within their organisations. The narrative that you're able to set up informs a lot within an organisational context. So, for example, we're working with an organisation who run a Women's Leadership Day every single year. This year will probably be the first time that it will not be full of white middle-class women talking about childcare 100% of the time and mentoring. That's only possible because certain people with significant power and influence in that organisation have recognised the absolute imperative of centering the voices of those who've been historically marginalised from quote-unquote women's spaces. That means women of colour, that means trans women, that means the women who exist within the Middle East and Africa part of the EMEA tag that don't normally get a look in. That means lots of different women who experience compound inequalities, and they are going to be centre stage, and it will be their narratives that everyone will have to be paying attention to and listening to. You could say, well, does it really take 3 days to get to that? Yeah, it takes 3 days and a lot of people to be able for that organisation to be within a context of ambition for itself, but also to recognise that then that playing it safe leaves some people, basically says, as we've said, we're not going to come to you until 2026. You can't play it safe because playing it safe means some people's lives aren't safe. And that's one example. And it's there's 1,500 people at this conference that they do every year. And it's a really big deal. So that's one example, and I would put that in the level of like changing the discourse, changing the narrative.
Totally.
Then there are other things that are much more kind of procedural and structural around ensuring that parental leave policy is inclusive and also includes trans people's experiences within there, which otherwise often get excluded, for example. And looking at the ways, the very architecture of their organisations and coming at it with an intersectional lens, which obviously you could say, well, it's just one sheet of paper, but it has the potential to impact hundreds of thousands of people, and importantly, including those who don't yet work in your organisation, which I think is really important. Some people say, but we don't have any X, Y, Z. Well, firstly, you don't know because you probably don't have the data, and also, why would they tell you? But number two, but maybe they're going to be here tomorrow, and wouldn't you want this to be a site where they can show up as their full selves then? So then there's the architectural piece, really just the everyday engagement that people have. Many stories of individual leaders being able to navigate very nuanced contexts, negotiating conflict between employees where some employees' rights, fundamental rights, are being denied by another, and before them saying, I wouldn't have known how to navigate that because I wouldn't have had a firm core. They wouldn't have had their internal guiding principles about how justice looks like in their spheres of influence. And again, cannot underestimate that. It's so easy to be the leader that says, oh, well, we just want us all to be friends, and then brushes everything under the carpet, rather than able to confront and say, no, whoever you are, that language is unacceptable and it endangers this other member of the team. And while you might want to say stuff, you don't just get to say stuff willy-nilly at the expense of somebody else's safety. And we need that level of integrity, I think, more than ever, particularly with the rise of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, hate crime against trans people. Everything's on the rise and rising. And while none of these things are new, I think it's really important that leaders are able to navigate that, and that people can can be who they need to be in work if they can't be when they're walking down the street at night, for example.
So one of the things I want to pick up on is one of the things you said just there was in organisations that might say, well, we haven't got that, and as you say, well, how would you know? And there are obviously certain intersections that are pretty damn obvious. You can observe them. They're gender, race or ethnicity, age, maybe even class. But then there are what I'd almost call the more invisible ones. So you can't always point at someone and say, well, they're LGBT, or and you yourself come from that mixed ethnicity background, like I do.
Yeah.
And obviously that's kind of I don't know if your experience has been it, but for me, being kind of Anglo-Indian, it's like I'm identified as white and probably think that way, but I'm neither completely white nor completely Asian, so I don't fit. So I guess my question is, what's the kind of impact of like the invisible intersections, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, they're just as important. They might have particular dynamics because of that invisible nature. Our need to challenge those inequalities is just as important alongside any. And also, as you've described, people can exist across visible and invisible or jumbling up together. What I would say is that, just kind of on the point around my own mixed heritage, I'm of mixed ethnicity, and that's really important to my identity. And there are lots of things that kind of are harmful to me when people speak about, for example, Islam, because I was raised Muslim. The very first thing I've ever learnt to memorize was the opening surah of the Quran.
Wow,
it's very like close to my heart, but simultaneously I am as white as can be, and I need to be able to be responsible for the impact that has while acknowledging that invisible part of my identity. But I would simply say that all of those pieces have, I guess it's like, if you're someone that doesn't experience whatever it might be, the default in your head should be, I should presume that I'm going to be doing harm with my behaviour unless I reconsider my assumptions about anything. Because as you say, you don't know somebody's sexuality just by looking at them, nor do you know necessarily their gender identity,
right?
Or whatever it might be. And I think I guess it's about like, what's your default setting? Is your default setting that you're moving through the world happy clappy, not doing any harm to anyone, or is your default setting, hold on, I know I've got privilege here that shows up in some can show up in some really harmful ways, and therefore I need to constantly try and remove that and the harm that I'm doing to other people. And they're two obviously very different settings. One is about prevention rather than apologising, and one is, well, we'll just see what happens. I'll just go about my merry way. And in some ways, we can never quantify what's more harmful or not. We just have to, all of this stuff, all these oppressions are harmful, and it's the responsibility of those ultimately who don't experience them to put an end to them as beneficiaries.
So, kind of flipping on its head, kind of starting from that place of, those with power and privilege, as it were. I mean, I guess one of the basic psychological principles is we don't create change by making people, feel that they're wrong, as it were, or that kind of thing. So, there are, like you say, there are going to be people who, we know of, men, for example, who, the example you mentioned earlier, who kind of maybe bleat and complain about like the sexual discrimination thing, and that's not the same as being sexually assaulted or sexually whatever. And there are going to be people who are just in that position but blissfully unaware, maybe, or whatever. What's kind of the stance of bringing those people on board? So it's not an immediate, well, you're in that position, so therefore, you're quote unquote wrong or whatever.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So my first thing I think would be that it's very rare that you meet people who don't presume, just because you've raised the issue, that you think they're wrong. One of the greatest get out of jail free cards is to say, yeah, you've said I'm this or that, and you're like, hold on, we were just having a conversation about the increase in Islamophobic hate crime. And they're like, you're calling me a racist. No one said anything. So the kind of the quintessential lash out is a justification to not have to engage in the issue.
Right.
So that's the first thing I would say. But I would then go on and say that one of the things that we do in our work is support people to identify guilt and shame when they're showing up for them.
Right.
Because often adults, because we're not really taught this by and large,
No,
don't
absolutely.
understand when they are feeling those things. And guilt and shame have very, very unhelpful byproducts when
Absolutely
you're
right.
experiencing them. So we borrow from Brené Brown. She
Yeah,
uses
lovely.
guilt. Her definition is guilt is when you think I have done a bad thing and the thing that you've done is not aligned with your sense of your identity. And then shame is I am bad, when you've attached the behavior as an inherent dynamic to who you are. One of the things we therefore do is, okay, what does it feel like when we're being defensive? And we really basically support people to start to understand their emotions in their body, because that is one of the key blockers to being able to have a productive conversation.
Yeah.
When I get defensive about whatever it might be, I'm doing exactly what it is. I'm defending my sense of my own identity, because
Absolutely.
I believe that what I'm hearing is you've told me I've either done something or I am something that doesn't align with who I think I am.
Right.
Now, the bottom line with all of this stuff is that when you prioritize your own guilt, you're not, in fact, in service of correcting the harm that the other person might be experiencing. You're making it all about you, which is fine for like a little bit. But we can't just all sit around wallowing in our own guilt for stuff that we have done in the world. I mean, I would mainly say that's the work of therapists and counsellors, which is really important work. I'm not for us all to be able to kind of be responsible for our emotions. But within this particular context, if your guilt or shame is showing up such that you're trying to derail a conversation, you don't want to engage, you're trying to say, no, this isn't me, how dare you, or whatever it might be, that is simply an unproductive use of a person's time, energy, emotions, and it has an impact on other learners within the group. So our method is all about bringing that to the surface, having people close their eyes. Okay, what are the sensations you're feeling? Is it like you're hot all the way through your face? I don't want to be told that I'm this. Often no one's told you that you're anything.
Right.
You've taken all of these narratives and said you're whoever you are, and you're then using that and weaponizing it in order not to have a productive conversation where we can move through to action. You can only get to action if you've managed to put your guilt and shame aside, because you're fundamentally committed to being that person that is committed to engaging in that action. You can never really do it when you're just obsessed with your own guilt and shame, or when you don't want people to think that you're a bad person, because then all your effort is about performing, looking good. And looking good gets us nowhere in life. Gets us nowhere. And looking good, it's a killer. It kills all of this stuff. And the reality is, every single one of us who's committed to engaging in the work of equity and justice in the world is going to make mistakes.
Absolutely.
It's going to make mistakes. The key that I always say to participants is, they say, oh, but I don't want, if I use the wrong language, I don't want everyone to shout at me. And I say, no one's going to shout at you if you use the wrong language. But with using the wrong language in this space also means responsible for when you've been corrected, then using the right language. That's it. You don't have to get upset at anyone. If you use a word and it's a harmful word and we say, don't use that word, use this word, as far as I'm concerned, that's the end of the matter. Just use the new word. You don't have to say, oh, but I didn't know of this. Yeah, we know you didn't know. That's cool.
You don't need to create drama.
You don't need to create drama. Right? Just use the new word. It's cool. But often the guilt and the shame comes up. The looking good comes up, because we don't want to be someone that uses the wrong word, because we think people might think that we're not XYZ if we use the wrong word. And so we end up dragging people in to conversations where none needed to be had. Just commit to using the right word and we'll all be grand.
Absolutely. What I love about the sound of this, and I've seen some of the impact of it as well, is it's such brave work, and it's the experiential piece. And since you bring in notions like guilt and shame, you're into really deep stuff there, and and often the internal isms that we have about our own intersections. If I had internal homophobia, for example, that kind of thing, which for me is like the true personal development. Bringing this back to kind of organisations and that kind of thing. I mean, and I think this, from the Mavericks' point of view, this kind of speaks to having like purpose-driven organisations that are serving other organisations?
Right.
Because you're not, obviously, the organisations you work with aren't just kind of not-for-profits or
No.
NGOs. You know, you're working
And
with
they
some,
are for profit,
Yeah.
for profit.
and like big, well-known
Yeah,
names as well.
yeah.
So what is the kind of, you know, we might say kind of equity, justice, but as you say, when you were in the investment bank, not everyone believed we needed a new banking system. So what becomes like the business case, for example, or let's just say the business case within those kind of organisations for engaging in this work?
Yeah. So we don't engage with the business case at all as an organisation for a few reasons.
Love that.
Yeah. The first is that no one's ever presented a business case for why white people should be employed in their organisation. No one's ever funded that research. I don't know if you've seen it. No one's ever funded it.
It's entirely true.
Never been funded. That's interesting, isn't it?
It's really interesting.
Because white people just deserve to be there.
That's the fundamental
That's
assumption
it. That's
we
the
have,
fundamental
isn't
assumption.
it?
They just that men. No one's ever done a business case on should men have a right. You know, what's the return on investment of men? I mean, Lord help us, right?
That.
No one's done it because everyone just believes they deserve to be there.
Right.
So the reason we don't engage in the business case is because to do so has some underneath it all. There's an implicit message that you need to prove why some groups of people deserve to have a job. Right, deserve to be employed, and we're just not in the business of doing that because our assumption is, well, of course, if you want to tell me that they don't deserve to be there, go ahead, but we're probably not going to be the right people to work with you. So by discounting that argument altogether, we're just not going to get into that conversation, which is really we're like, you can be in that paradigm, but we're going to be in this paradigm. If you want to be in this paradigm with us, let's work together.
So no convincing.
Just very clear. You're there, we're here, that's fine. And so for us, that's really then makes it really clear. But what we know is that the people that we work with, they might have written papers on business cases here, there, whatever. You know, we're not preventing other people from doing whatever they want to do in their own time on their own emails, of course. But what we're ultimately offering people is you can have cultures. We do believe it is possible to have cultures in your organisation where there is fairness, where there is equity, and there is belonging. If you also want that and want to work with us to do it, we will help you to do it.
Love that.
And then that's it. It's quite simple. And if they're like, well, we're not really sure, okay,
fine.
Bye.
Yeah.
That's the end.
Again, there's this theme of bravery that, you know, if Brené Brown is all about kind of vulnerability, for example. I mean, I guess the title is, the word is implicit in the name of the organisation, Fearless Futures. I mean, I'm kind of curious, do you see yourself as a courageous or a brave person?
Yes, I guess so. I feel, it doesn't mean I don't feel fear. I think that's something that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
But my mum had this great self-help book in the 80s on her shelf called Fear and Do It Anyway.
Susan Jeffers.
Right. Yeah. I've never read it. I only ever saw that.
Yeah.
But whenever...
You kind of got the gist of it from the
just
spine.
From the spine. She didn't need to write 300 pages.
No, absolutely.
But I guess it's like, that's something for me. It doesn't mean I always get it right. Can get it wrong. I'm not suggesting it's, you know, that I'm perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think to work at Fearless Futures, I think all of us have to be pretty courageous people, because we're often speaking things that aren't being spoken by other people in context that they're never being spoken. To even utter the word racism or heterosexism or whatever you might in a corporate context and say, no, this is a real thing this is a real thing and it's happening here and it's happening now, doesn't really happen.
No.
And so yes. Now, what I would also say is that I get to potentially take greater risks than other members of the team because of who I am in the world, because of my whiteness. I get to say things about race that not all people of colour necessarily get to say with safety, right? Because I'm heterosexual, I can say things about heterosexism that other people wouldn't be able to say. Because I'm cis and not trans, it's safer fundamentally for me to be able to say, hold on, that's not right. no, we need to prioritize this because the risks just don't really exist. They're very small, they're very short-lived, which is something that we really try and get people that we know to really like get and digest. It's like, it might feel scary, but it's just not the same for the person that's actually living in that reality. So yeah, I think there's courage abounds across all 6 of us and our facilitators as well, whether it's in schools or in organisations.
I think they kind of it's clearly endemic, because if part of your thing is, as you say, we don't get involved in like business cases. You're really building a kind of, it's almost what I'd call like the Pied Piper approach to marketing. It's like, this is what we're about. If that appeals to you, it's kind of almost a culture of attraction, if you like.
That's really interesting that you've used that phrase, because we've never really done marketing at all. I wouldn't even know how to market us. Like, what would we say? But people have started, and again, this is in the last year, getting in touch with us because they've heard from other people that something important has happened, either for them or in their organisation. And I love that culture of attraction. I'm going to use that, Chris, if you don't mind.
No, not at all. Please. So, some huge things to consider there as CEO, and things to wrestle with, as it were. I guess kind of just beginning to round off, as it were. I'm kind of curious, like, let's bring this right back to Hanna McCloskey, as it were. I'm just kind of curious because I'm sure there are days when certain days are easier than others, as it were. When they're not so good, where do you go for to refill your wells of inspiration, that kind of stuff? Where do you kind of fill back up?
I go to my mother. She is an incredible human being, an extremely talented coach, just a phenomenal person who is, the person I personally turn to when I'm in need of kind of recentering myself, getting back on track, giving up the nonsense narratives that we all carry around with us that get in the way of being our best selves. So she's certainly the human that I go to require and actually need for that level of kind of emotional support. And then I love TV. Love watching TV, love Netflix, love Amazon Prime. I find really that TV is one of the few ways where I can really like switch off. I have a very, very energetic brain. I've always like got hundreds of ideas that not all of them are going to be sustainable or are going to be executed, but I do find that TV is the best way for me to kind of come down to earth a little bit rather than being up in the clouds. Those two things are my mother and my TV are the best.
Awesome. Hanna, thank you so much for your time today. This has been absolutely incredible. I think I've taken a lot from this, actually. And, this is probably going to be one of our longest podcasts. But as I think about this, I think I'm going to let this run as much as possible, because I think there's so much richness in what you've said. And for me, the thing I'm really taking from it is you're a different model of what bravery can look like. I think, there can be a real kind of stereotype of what bravery looks like or courage looks like, and you're just kind of showing up here, talking your stuff, doing your thing, but the point is you're doing it, and you're very grounded and down to earth and very warm, and I think this work is so important that obviously that and you're very aligned with our kind of values as well. So just thank you so much for your time, your generosity today, and for being such an amazing guest. Awesome. And there you go, Mavericks. That was Hanna McCloskey from Fearless Futures, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next podcast. Bye for now. That was the Mavericks Unlimited podcast, and thank you so much to Hanna McCloskey for being our guest this week. If you enjoyed this, please do subscribe and consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help other people find us. And with that, thanks for listening in, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye for now.